The village of St Mary Mead had seen finer summers, but none more dutifully celebrated than the one that brought the annual church garden fête to the vicarage lawn on the second Saturday in July. Bunting fluttered half-heartedly between the apple trees. Trestle tables groaned beneath Victoria sponges, jars of chutney, and the Women's Institute's famously unforgiving lemon curd. Children darted between skirts like minnows, and the brass band from Much Benham wheezed its way through a selection from the Mikado that only the very old or very deaf pretended to enjoy. Miss Jane Marple sat in a deck chair beneath the cedar, her grey knit shawl arranged with precision over her shoulders, knitting needles clicking softly as pink wool grew into something intended for the baby's welcoming basket. From this vantage point, she could observe almost the entire lawn, without appearing to observe anything at all. It was a talent she had cultivated over 8 decades, and one she found more reliable than any newspaper. At 3:30, the vicar, dear Reverend Leonard Clements, mounted the little platform to declare the fête open and to thank Mrs. Bantry for the loan of Gossington Hall's silver cups as prizes. Mrs. Bantry, large and good-natured, beamed from the front row. Beside her sat Colonel Bantry, already asleep with his hat over his eyes. Dr. Haydock circulated with a glass that was certainly not his first lemonade of the afternoon, and young Mrs. Dane Calthrop, the vicar's wife, fluttered from stall to stall in a print dress that looked as though it had been designed by a committee of butterflies. Everything was precisely as it always was, until it was not. The scream came from the second-hand bookstall operated that year by Miss Blacklock, who had come to live at Little Paddocks only 6 months earlier, and her companion, Miss Murgatroyd. It was not a dramatic scream. It was the short, sharp kind that escapes before the mind has decided whether to be frightened or merely annoyed. A small knot of people gathered at once. Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap and watched. Mr. Elliot, the church warden, pushed forward. "What's the trouble, Miss Blacklock?" Miss Blacklock stood very straight, one hand pressed to her throat. In the other, she held a large, rather battered family Bible, one of those heavy Victorian affairs, bound in black leather with brass clasps. Between its pages protruded a single sheet of paper. It's a note," she said, her voice thin but steady. "Someone has left a note inside the Bible." Inspector Craddock, who happened to be off duty and escorting his aunt, Miss Marple, pushed gently through the crowd. He was a tall young man with an air of courteous disbelief in the possibility of serious crime occurring anywhere south of Birmingham. "May I see?" he asked. Miss Blacklock handed him the Bible. The note, written in ordinary blue ink on a page torn from a cheap writing pad, was brief. "To whom it may concern, by sunset tomorrow, one of us will be dead. This is not a joke. Watch the hands of the clock in the vicarage hall." There was no signature. A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the onlookers, quickly stifled. Mrs. Harmon from the post office declared that it must be one of the boys from the grammar school. Mrs. Price Ridley announced that standards were falling everywhere, and that in her young day, such a thing would never have been tolerated. Young Mrs. Hicks from the housing estate giggled and said it sounded like something out of a cinema film. Reverend Clements looked distressed. "Perhaps we should give the note to the police," he suggested mildly. "I am the police," Craddock said with a faint smile, folding the paper into his pocketbook. "Though I suspect this is someone's idea of a practical joke. All the same, I'll look into it." The band struck up again, more out of duty than conviction, and the crowd began to disperse toward the tea tent. The incident, alarming for perhaps 90 seconds, was already being reshaped into anecdote. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. Her needles moved without pause, yet her eyes followed Miss Blacklock as the woman returned to her stall, spine rigid, lips pressed together. Beside her, Miss Murgatroyd kept glancing nervously toward the vicarage, where the clock in the hall could be seen through the open French windows, its gilded hands at 25 minutes to 4. "Curious," murmured Miss Marple to nobody in particular. Dr. Haydock paused beside her chair. "You're not taking that nonsense seriously, are you, Miss Marple?" "Oh, I never take anything seriously until I have to, Doctor. But one does notice things. That Bible, for instance. A strange place to leave a message, don't you think?" "Any port in a storm, I suppose," Haydock said jovially. "Though why anyone should want to frighten poor Miss Blacklock, I can't imagine. She's only been here 5 minutes. 6 months and 3 weeks, Miss Marple corrected gently. Long enough in a village for people to decide what sort of person she is, and perhaps long enough for her to decide what sort of people we are." Haydock laughed and moved on. The sun slid lower. Shadows lengthened across the lawn. At the cake stall, Mrs. Dane Calthrop was attempting to persuade Colonel Bantry that he really did want a second slice of seed cake. At the coconut shy, young Tommy Symington was trying to impress Julia Simmons by knocking down coconuts he had no intention of carrying home. Everything, once again, appeared perfectly normal. Only Miss Marple noticed that Miss Blacklock had left her stall and was walking very slowly toward the vicarage gate, and that Mr. Julian Harmon, the vicar's new curate, usually so vague and otherworldly, was watching her with an expression that might almost have been anxiety. And high in the vicarage itself, the clock on the landing ticked with solemn authority, its hands creeping toward the hour when, somewhere in St Mary Mead, the ordinary afternoon would fracture into something far less pleasant. Miss Marple finished a row, turned her knitting, and began another. Pink wool for an innocent baby. Black-edged clouds gathering over an English village summer. One never could tell, she reflected, what might be hidden between the pages of even the most respectable lives. By 7 o'clock, the news had traveled the length and breadth of St Mary Mead with the speed of a bushfire in a high wind. It had been refined, embroidered, and occasionally contradicted in the telling, but the central pillar remained. A threatening note had been found in a Bible at the fête, and Miss Blacklock of Little Paddocks was the intended victim. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Curtis the landlord poured pints with one hand and collected theories with the other. "Mark my words," said Mr. Fletcher from the garage, wiping foam from his moustache. "It's one of those London gangs. They follow people down from town. Read about it in the Sunday papers." His audience nodded sagely, though none of them had ever seen a London gangster closer than the pictures. Across the high street, in the refined gloom of Mrs. Price Ridley's drawing room, the ladies of the older generation took a different line. "Foreigners," pronounced Mrs. Price Ridley, closing her lips with the decisiveness of a mousetrap. "Ever since that family of refugees moved into the council houses, nothing has been safe." Mrs. Bantry, who had dropped in for a cup of coffee and a gossip, gave a small snort. "My dear, the note was written in perfectly good English on Basildon bond notepaper. Hardly the hallmark of displaced persons." "Then it's someone with a grudge," said Miss Hartnell, bristling like a terrier. "That woman has money. You can tell by the way she dresses. Money always brings trouble." At the vicarage, Reverend Clements was attempting to soothe his wife, who had worked herself into a state of high indignation. "It's wicked, Leonard, wicked and sacrilegious, to put such a thing in a Bible." "My dear, the Bible was only the hiding place. The sin is in the intention, not the stationery." But Mrs. Dane Calthrop refused to be comforted. She had already telephoned the bishop's wife, who was unfortunately out, and was now contemplating a special prayer for the protection of the parish. Miss Blacklock herself had gone home early, pleading a headache. Miss Murgatroyd, round, anxious, and perpetually apologetic, had accompanied her, clucking like a distressed hen. By 8 o'clock, Little Paddocks was shut up tight, curtains drawn, though every light in the house blazed as though darkness itself might be held at bay by a dozen 40-watt bulbs. In the cottage next to the post office, Miss Marple sat by her open window, a cup of cocoa cooling beside her. The evening smelled of sweet williams and warm stock bricks. From time to time, a late blackbird scolded in the lilac tree. Otherwise, the village was unusually quiet, as though holding its breath. She had just turned to her seed catalogue when there came a gentle tap at the French window. It was Dr. Haydock, hat in hand, looking amused. "I've been dispatched as an official deputation," he announced. "The entire village is in a ferment, and apparently only you can calm them down. May I come in?" Miss Marple smiled and drew back the curtain. "Of course, Doctor, though I cannot imagine why anyone should think an old woman can calm anything." "Because you have a reputation," Haydock said, stepping inside, "for seeing nonsense for what it is. Half the parish is convinced Miss Blacklock will be murdered in her bed tonight. The other half think it's an advertising stunt for the new detective serial on the wireless." Miss Marple poured him a small glass of elderflower, cordial. She did not hold with spirits after 8 o'clock, and settled herself opposite him. "And what do you think, Doctor?" Haydock shrugged. "I think someone wishes to frighten her. Whether they mean more than that remains to be seen. She's not an easy woman to frighten, our Miss Blacklock. Came through the war running a canteen in Bristol during the worst of the raids. But even the strongest of us can be worn down." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "And who might wish to wear her down?" "That," said Haydock, "is what everyone is asking. She keeps herself to herself. Has money, nobody knows quite how much. Lives with that funny little friend of hers, Miss Murgatroyd, and employs a foreign girl to do the rough. There's a nephew who visits from time to time. Artist fellow, rather intense. Beyond that, she's a closed book." "Closed books," murmured Miss Marple. "Sometimes have the most interesting passages tucked between the pages." Haydock laughed. "There you go again. Well, I must be off. I promised Mrs. Harmon I'd look in on old Mrs. Weatherby. She's convinced the murderer is hiding in her cucumber frame." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat a little longer by the window. She was thinking about the note. Not the words. Those were crude enough. But the choice of hiding place. A Bible on a second-hand stall. Anyone might have found it. A child, the vicar, Mrs. Bantry looking for a cookery book. Yet the writer had been certain that sooner or later, Miss Blacklock herself would open that particular volume, which suggested to Miss Marple's orderly mind that the writer knew a great deal about Miss Blacklock's habits. Up at Little Paddock's, the lights still blazed. In the kitchen, Mitzi, the Austrian refugee maid, was banging saucepans with unnecessary violence and declaring to the empty air that in her country such notes would mean the police arrived within minutes and somebody would be shot. Miss Murgatroyd, attempting to make cocoa, kept dropping the spoons and apologizing to nobody in particular. In the sitting room, Miss Blacklock sat very upright in an armchair, a cigarette burning unnoticed between her fingers. She had changed into a crimson dressing gown that made her look, her friend Bunch Harmon would later say, like an extremely competent cardinal. Her face was calm, but the hand that held the cigarette trembled just enough to scatter ash onto the carpet. At 10:30, the telephone rang. Miss Murgatroyd almost dropped the tray she was carrying. "Let it ring," Miss Blacklock said sharply, but it went on, ringing, insistent, until at last she rose and went into the hall herself. "Yes?" Her voice was crisp. A pause. Then, very softly, a man's voice, cultured, amused, almost familiar. "Sunset tomorrow, Letitia. Watch the clock." The line went dead. Miss Blacklock stood for a long moment with the receiver in her hand. Then, very deliberately, she replaced it and walked back into the sitting room. "Who was it, Letty?" Miss Murgatroyd quavered. "Nobody," said Miss Blacklock. "A wrong number." But when she sat down again, she reached for the whiskey decanter instead of the cocoa, and her hand did not tremble any more. In the cottage by the post office, Miss Marple closed her seed catalogue, turned out the lamp, and went upstairs to bed. As she passed the window, she paused for a moment, looking across the darkened village toward the distant glow of Little Paddocks. "Someone," she said softly to the empty room, "is playing a very old game. And games, you know, have rules. even when the players pretend they do not. She drew the curtains, shutting out the night, and the village slept uneasily beneath a thin summer moon that looked, to those few still awake, remarkably like the face of a clock. Sunday morning broke with a soft, deceptive mildness. The bells of St Mary Mead called the faithful to matins, and the scent of frying bacon drifted from cottage windows as though nothing more sinister than overboiled cabbage threatened the parish. Miss Marple attended early service, 8 o'clock, decently quiet and mercifully free of Mrs. Price Ridley's commentary. Afterwards, she walked slowly home past the vicarage, pausing to admire the Reverend Clement's roses. The vicar, still in his cassock, emerged looking harassed. "Ah, Miss Marple, you have heard about this dreadful business, I suppose." "I have heard a great many things, Vicar, most of them contradictory." Reverend Clements gave a despairing little laugh. "Quite. The telephone has not stopped. Mrs. Dane Calthrop is convinced we are harboring a homicidal maniac. I myself incline to the view that it is a very stupid practical joke, but one does not like to say so too loudly in case—" He left the sentence dangling like an unfinished collect. "In case it is not a joke," Miss Marple finished gently. "Quite right, Vicar. Caution is always wise when one is dealing with human nature." She continued on her way, stopping at the post office for her Sunday paper. Mrs. Harmon, bunched to her friends, was behind the counter, round and beaming and incapable of keeping a secret for more than 30 seconds. "Isn't it dreadful, Miss Marple? Poor Miss Blacklock didn't come to church. Miss Murgatroyd telephoned to say she had one of her migraines, though between ourselves, I don't believe Miss Blacklock ever has migraines. She's not the type." "No," agreed Miss Marple thoughtfully. "She's not the type." By 11 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had arrived from Much Benham, this time in an official baby Austin, and accompanied by Sergeant Fletcher, a large young man who looked as though he would be more at home playing rugby than detecting crime. They began, properly enough, at Little Paddock's. Miss Blacklock received them in the drawing-room with perfect composure. She wore a well-cut tweed skirt and a twin set the color of heather, and might have been expecting them to discuss the price of bulbs for the autumn planting. Craddock came straight to the point. "The telephone call last night, Miss Blacklock. You are quite sure you did not recognize the voice?" "Quite sure. It was a man's voice. Yes. Disguised in any way?" She hesitated the merest fraction. "It was muffled, as though the speaker held a handkerchief over the mouthpiece. One reads of such things." Sergeant Fletcher wrote laboriously in his notebook. "And you have no idea who might wish to threaten you?" "None whatever. I've lived a most unadventurous life, Inspector. I worked for many years as secretary to Mr. Randall Girdler, the financier. When he died, his fortune passed to his wife, and on her death, should she predecease me, which seemed likely, a substantial part was to come to me. Mrs. Girdler is now very frail. That is the extent of my wealth, if one can call it that. Apart from that, I have no enemies that I know of." Craddock tried another tack. "The note mentioned the clock in the vicarage hall. Do you know why that particular clock should be singled out?" Miss Blacklock smiled faintly. "I have not the remotest idea, perhaps because it is notoriously unreliable. It gains 6 minutes every day, and the vicar refuses to have it seen to. He says it reminds him that time is not our own." From the doorway came an agitated squeak. Miss Murgatroyd, who had been hovering with a tray of coffee, nearly dropped it. "Oh, the clock. I quite forgot. Letty, do you remember last week when we were helping with the flowers for the chancel, and you said—" "Yes, Bunny dear, I remember perfectly," Miss Blacklock cut in smoothly. "I said the clock was exactly what one would expect in a vicarage. Charming, but inaccurate. Nothing more." Miss Murgatroyd subsided, looking puzzled and apologetic. Craddock closed his notebook. "Very well, Miss Blacklock. We shall, of course, examine the Bible for fingerprints, though I fear on a second-hand stall that will be hopeless. In the meantime, I must ask you to take elementary precautions. Lock doors and windows after dark. Admit no strangers. Miss Blacklock's smile did not waver. I have Mitzi to protect me, Inspector. She was in the resistance, or so she says, and is convinced that every Englishman is a potential assassin. I shall be quite safe. After the police had gone, Miss Murgatroyd turned worried eyes on her friend. Letty, why didn't you tell them about the other thing? Because there is nothing to tell, Bunny. Miss Blacklock's voice was suddenly sharp. Nothing at all. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had accepted an invitation to Sunday luncheon with the Bantrys at Gossington Hall. Colonel Bantry was in high spirits, carving the saddle of mutton with military precision, while Mrs. Bantry plied Miss Marple with second helpings and information in roughly equal measure. Arthur says it's all poppycock, she announced, passing the roast potatoes. But then Arthur thinks anything that happens south of the Trent is poppycock, unless it involves horse racing. I say there's no smoke without fire. And that nephew of hers, Edmund de la Fontaine, or whatever he calls himself this week, he was down last weekend looking as black as thunder. Artists are always temperamental, of course, but really. Miss Blacklock has a nephew? Miss Marple asked with mild interest. Well, great-nephew, or second cousin, twice removed. Something complicated. Swears he's devoted to her, but you know how these young men are when there's money in the offing. And then there's that secretary woman who turned up out of the blue last month. Miss Hinchcliffe says she recognized her from somewhere, though she can't remember where. Colonel Bantry grunted. Hinchcliffe sees spies in every teacup. Probably recognized the woman from the pictures. Miss Marple ate her mutton and listened. One never knew what might prove useful. At 3 o'clock she took a gentle stroll that happened to bring her past little paddocks. The gate stood open. In the garden, Miss Hinchcliffe, tall, cropped, and fiercely masculine in corduroys, was attacking a laurel bush with shears as though it had given personal offense. Beside her, softer and rounder, Miss Murgatroyd pottered with a watering can. They greeted Miss Marple with relief, clearly grateful for any audience that was not police. "Isn't it ghastly?" Miss Hinchcliffe boomed. Poor Letty's being positively noble about it, but one can see she's shaken, and that wretched girl Mitzi has locked herself in the kitchen and is singing the Marseillaise at the top of her voice. Says it keeps evil spirits away. Miss Murgatroyd lowered her voice. "Do you think it could be someone in the village, Miss Marple? Someone who bears a grudge?" "My dear," said Miss Marple comfortably, "in a village everyone bears a grudge against someone about something. The trick is discovering which grudge is worth murdering for." Miss Hinchcliffe gave a bark of laughter. "You're a caution, Miss Marple, and no mistake." Miss Marple smiled and moved on, but not before she had noticed two things. First, that the grandfather clock in the Hall of Little Paddocks, visible through the open front door, was almost, but not quite, in harmony with her own little traveling clock. And second, that Miss Murgatroyd, for all her nervous fluttering, had very shrewd grey eyes that missed little. As she walked home through the sleepy Sunday lanes, Miss Marple turned over in her mind the small things she had observed. The way Miss Blacklock's left hand had tightened on the arm of her chair when the vicarage clock was mentioned. The half-second of hesitation before she denied recognizing the telephone voice. The quick, almost frightened way Miss Murgatroyd had been silenced. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that Inspector Craddock would think worth writing in his notebook. But Miss Marple had spent 78 years watching people pretend to be what they were not. And she knew, as certainly as she knew that Mrs. Price Ridley's rock cakes were indigestible, that Miss Blacklock was hiding something. The question was, what exactly, and from whom? Far away in the vicarage, the unreliable clock struck 4, 6 minutes too early, as always. And somewhere, someone smiled at the sound. Monday morning brought a thin, drizzling rain that turned the high street the color of porridge and drove gossip indoors. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Craddock had established a temporary headquarters in the vicarage study and was attempting to look efficient, while Reverend Clements hovered with offers of coffee and apologetic explanations about the state of the chairs. The official theory, rapidly hardening, was simple and comforting. The culprit was Patrick Simmons, or possibly Edmund Swettenham. Opinions differed. The artistic young man who was Miss Blacklock's second cousin, once removed and occasional visitor. He had been seen at the fête. He was known to be hard up. He had a reputation for wild jokes, and, most damning of all, he had once, at a party in Chelsea, pretended to be a burglar and frightened an elderly hostess into hysterics. St Mary Mead, which had never met the elderly hostess, felt this settled the matter. Craddock, who had spent the previous evening reading statements and discovering that Patrick Simmons had been in Bournemouth on the day of the fête, was less convinced. But theories, once rooted in village soil, are harder to dig out than ground elder. At 11 o'clock he interviewed the young man himself at the Blue Boar. Patrick Simmons, dark, thin, and wearing a plum-colored corduroy jacket that Mrs. Price Ridley considered proof of morale decay, lounged against the bar and regarded the inspector with lazy amusement. "Yes, I heard about the note. Ghastly bad taste. But if you think I wrote it, you're barking up the wrong family tree. I adore my cousin Letty. She sends me £5 notes when I'm broke and never asks questions. Why on earth should I want to frighten her to death?" "For the money that will come to you when Mrs. Godler dies," Craddock said bluntly. Patrick's eyebrows rose. "My dear Inspector, half the beneficiaries under that will are probably planning murder at this very moment. There's Pip and Emma, whoever they may be. Twins, I believe, brought up abroad and never heard of since the war. There's the dreadful Julia in the Highlands, and there's me. But Letty has to die first, you see, before any of us get a penny. Killing her now would be rather like burning down the house to roast the pig." Craddock was forced to admit the logic, though he did not like the young man's flippancy. Meanwhile, at Little Paddocks, the atmosphere had grown brittle. Mitzi, the Austrian maid, had announced that she was leaving at once. No money in the world would induce her to stay in a house where murder was planned. Miss Blacklock, with weary patience, had given her a week's wages in lieu of notice and told her to pack. Mitzi had retired to the kitchen in tears, declaring that she would go to the police and tell them everything. What everything consisted of remained unspecified. Miss Murgatroyd, attempting to be helpful, had taken to following her friend about the house with anxious little cries of, "Letty, are you sure you're all right?" Until Miss Blacklock snapped that if one more person asked her that question, she would scream. Only one inhabitant of Little Paddocks appeared completely unperturbed. Philippa Hames, the quiet, beautiful young war widow who rented the small lodge and helped with the garden in return for reduced rent. Philippa went about her work as usual, weeding the herbaceous border with the calm of someone who has already looked death in the face and found it less frightening than unpaid bills. Miss Marple encountered her that afternoon when she called with a jar of calf's foot jelly, an excuse so transparent that even Miss Blacklock smiled when she opened the door. "I shan't keep you," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the drawing room as though departure were the last thing on her mind. "I merely wish to inquire how you did after all this upset." Miss Blacklock gave a short laugh. "One survives, Miss Marple. One has survived worse." "Indeed one has," agreed Miss Marple, her eyes wandering gently round the room. They rested for a moment on the mantelpiece, where a small ormolu clock ticked with expensive accuracy. "What a pretty clock. Cox and Son, isn't it? My nephew has one very like it, though I notice yours is 3 minutes slower than the church clock." "Is it?" Miss Blacklock seemed indifferent. "Clocks are such tiresome things. The one in the hall is always right, at least. It was my father's. He set great store by punctuality." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the writing desk by the window. It was open. A pile of letters lay half-sorted. On the top was one in a man's handwriting, the envelope franked from Paris. "Such a nuisance, correspondence," Miss Marple murmured. "I always think one should answer letters at once, before one forgets. Though, of course, some letters are better left unanswered." Miss Blacklock's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward the pile, turning the Paris letter face down. At that moment, Miss Murgatroyd came in with the tea tray, and the conversation turned to the safer ground of women's institute politics. When Miss Marple left, 20 minutes later, she walked slowly down the drive, pausing to speak to Philippa Hames, who was tying up dahlias. "A trying time for all of you," Miss Marple observed. Philippa straightened, pushing a strand of fair hair from her eyes. "Yes, though I can't help feeling it's all rather unreal. Like a play one has seen before." "Exactly like a play," Miss Marple agreed. "And in plays, you know, the person who seems least concerned is often the one who knows most." Philippa gave her a quick, troubled glance, but said nothing. That evening, Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage to return a book she had lent his aunt the previous Christmas. He found her shelling peas in the garden, an occupation that seemed to require her entire attention. "Well, Inspector," she said, not looking up, "have you arrested the right person yet?" Craddock laughed ruefully. "Between ourselves, no. Young Simmons has an alibi for the crucial time, and anyway, the whole thing feels wrong. Too theatrical. As though someone wants us to look in one direction while the real business is happening somewhere else." "Quite," said Miss Marple, dropping peas into a colander with soft, precise plops. "Like the conjurer who waves a red scarf so that one does not notice the rabbit being slipped into the hat." Craddock regarded her with affectionate exasperation. "Have you noticed anything I've missed, Miss Marple?" "Oh, several things," she said placidly, "but nothing that would interest the police. Only that Miss Blacklock is left-handed, yet the note was written by a right-handed person. That the Bible on the bookstall came from the vicarage library. The Reverend Clements has a passion for pasting his own bookplate inside every volume. And that someone has recently cleaned the grandfather clock in the hall at Little Paddocks, very thoroughly indeed, though the rest of the furniture is allowed to gather dust. Such little things, you know, hardly evidence." Craddock stared at her. "You think the threat comes from inside the house?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone very much wants us to believe it comes from outside. And that, Inspector, is always interesting." Above them, the sky had cleared to a pale, washed blue. Somewhere, a church clock struck 6. At Little Paddocks, the grandfather clock answered, solemn and slightly out of step, as though reminding the world that time in St Mary Mead was never quite what it seemed. And in the vicarage hall, the old landing clock, 6 minutes fast as always, moved its hands inexorably toward the hour that had been promised. "Sunset tomorrow," the note had said. There were now less than 30 hours left. Tuesday dawned sullen and windless, the sky the color of wet pewter. By 9 o'clock, the village had settled into the particular hush that precedes a storm or a funeral. Miss Marple spent the morning in her small greenhouse, pricking out winter lettuce and thinking about clocks. She had always found that seedlings and suspicions flourished best when given more or less the same treatment. Gentle warmth, careful attention, and the certainty that nothing would be forced before its proper time. At 10:30, she put on her second-best coat, armed herself with a sponge bag containing 2 slices of Madeira cake, and set out on what she described to her maid Cherry as a little errand of mercy. Her first port of call was the vicarage. Mrs. Dane Calthrop, still vibrating with righteous indignation, received her in the drawing room. "I simply cannot understand Leonard's calmness," she announced, pouring tea so strong it could have stood without the cup. "He says we must wait upon events. Wait when a murder is promised for sunset." "Dear Mrs. Dane Calthrop," murmured Miss Marple, "your husband is a very wise man. Events, you know, have a way of arriving whether one waits or not." She accepted a cup and allowed the conversation to drift to parish matters. The new hymn books, the leak in the vestry roof, the extraordinary price of lilies. Only when Mrs. Dane Calthrop paused for breath did Miss Marple introduce, very delicately, the subject of the second-hand books at the fête. "I happened to notice," she said, "that the Bible came from your husband's own shelves. Such a handsome volume. I wondered whether he remembered how it came to be among the donations. Mrs. Dane Calthrop's eyes brightened with the light of one who has been waiting days for someone to ask the right question. It was the strangest thing. Leonard found it on the hall table on Friday evening with a note in Mitzi's handwriting. Mitzi from Little Paddocks, you know, saying Miss Blacklock thought the vicarage might like to have it for the sale. Leonard assumed it was a pious offering and never opened it. Men are extraordinarily trusting. Extraordinarily, agreed Miss Marple. And Mitzi brought it herself? No. She telephoned to say she was sending it by hand. It must have been Philippa Hames who left it. She was arranging flour that afternoon. Miss Marple finished her tea and took her leave, pausing on the doorstep to admire a bed of Michaelmas daisies. From the vicarage gate she could see the landing window and, just visible, the face of the unreliable clock. Its hands stood at 20 minutes to 11. She walked on, slowly, toward Little Paddocks. The front door was opened by Miss Murgatroyd, who looked as though she had not slept. "Oh, Miss Marple, do come in. Letty's resting, but I'm sure she'll want to see you. We're all at 6s and 7s. Mitzi has locked herself in her room again and is packing and unpacking alternately. I declare I don't know whether I'm coming or going." Miss Marple followed her into the drawing room and sat down with the air of one prepared to wait quietly until doomsday if necessary. Presently, Miss Blacklock appeared, pale but composed, wearing a dark green dress that made her look more than ever like a capable cardinal. "You are very kind to call," she said. "I fear we are poor company today." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied. "I've come to return something that belongs to you." She opened her sponge bag and took out, not the expected Madeira cake, but a small, much-worn prayer book bound in faded purple leather. Miss Blacklock stared at it. "That isn't mine." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "It belongs to Miss Murgatroyd. I found it yesterday on the stall after the excitement. It had fallen behind some copies of Black Beauty. The bookstall was in such disarray, you remember." Miss Murgatroyd gave a little cry. "My prayer book. I missed it on Sunday. I thought I must have left it in church." "You left it here," Miss Marple said, "on Friday afternoon when you and Miss Blacklock were arranging the flowers at the vicarage. It was in the pocket of your gardening coat. You hung the coat in the cloakroom just inside the hall, beside the table where someone later left the Bible." There was a tiny silence. Miss Blacklock's eyes flicked very quickly to the grandfather clock in the corner. Its hands showed 14 minutes to 11. Miss Murgatroyd looked bewildered. "But what has my prayer book to do with anything?" "Only this," Miss Marple said. "When I picked it up yesterday, a scrap of paper had been used as a bookmark. It had slipped down between the pages." She opened the prayer book and drew out a torn half-sheet of cheap notepaper. On it, in ordinary blue ink, were the words, "By sunset tomorrow, one of us will—" The rest was missing. Miss Blacklock's face did not change, but something altered in the quality of her stillness. "Where did you find that?" she asked very quietly. "Between the pages of the prayer book you left at the vicarage on Friday," Miss Marple repeated. "The paper is identical to the note found in the Bible. The ink is the same. And the handwriting, well, one would need an expert to be certain, but I think even I can see that the formation of the letter F is identical and the way the T is crossed rather high." Miss Murgatroyd made a small strangled sound. Miss Blacklock looked from the prayer book to Miss Marple and then, slowly, to the clock. "You are very observant, Miss Marple." "One tries to be, though of course it is only a torn scrap. It might mean anything, or nothing." Miss Blacklock smiled then, a thin, hard smile that did not reach her eyes. "Exactly. It might mean nothing at all." Miss Marple rose. "I shall leave the prayer book with you, Miss Murgatroyd, and the little piece of paper. I'm sure the police will not trouble you about it. After all, it is only half a message." She said goodbye with her usual gentle courtesy and walked down the drive. At the gate, she paused to speak to Philippa Hames, who was wheeling a barrow of leaves. Such a pleasant morning for gardening, Miss Marple observed. Philippa gave her a strained smile. One does what one can. Quite, though I always think autumn leaves are rather melancholy. They remind one how quickly things disappear. Philippa's hands tightened on the barrow handles. Miss Marple walked on. Behind her, in the drawing-room of Little Paddocks, Miss Blacklock stood very still, staring at the scrap of paper as though it were a scorpion. Miss Murgatroyd watched her with wide, frightened eyes. At 12 o'clock precisely, the grandfather clock in the hall struck the hour with sonorous authority, and somewhere in the house a door closed very softly. Miss Marple, turning into the lane, reflected that she had now given someone a great deal to think about before sunset. The afternoon slid by like a dull knife through cold sweet. At 3 o'clock, Inspector Craddock called again at Little Paddocks, this time with the air of a man who has been told off by his superiors for wasting petrol. He found Miss Blacklock alone in the drawing-room. Miss Murgatroyd had taken refuge with Miss Hinchcliffe at Boulders, and Mitzi was sulking in the kitchen with the door bolted. Craddock came straight to the point. "Miss Blacklock, I have just come from the vicarage. The Reverend Clements has remembered something rather curious. On Friday afternoon, while you and Miss Murgatroyd were arranging the flowers, you asked him whether the old clock on the landing could be relied upon to strike the hour correctly. You seemed particularly anxious about it." Miss Blacklock's eyebrows rose. "Did I? I dare say I did. I have a horror of being late for things, but I cannot see why that should interest the police." "Nor can I," Craddock admitted, "except that the threatening note specifically mentioned that clock. It begins to look as though the writer knew you would be at the vicarage on Friday and knew you would open the Bible." Miss Blacklock lit a cigarette with deliberate calm. "A great many people knew I was doing the flowers, and the Bible was on the table with the other donations. Anyone might have slipped the note inside." "True," said Craddock, "but only someone who knew your habits very well would be certain you would be the one to pick it up." Miss Blacklock exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "My dear Inspector, you are determined to make a mountain out of a molehill. I've told you I have no enemies." Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. "Very well, madam. But sunset is at 22 minutes past 6 this evening. After that, if nothing has happened, we may all breathe more easily." When he had gone, Miss Blacklock stood for a long time by the window, staring out at the sodden garden. Then she went upstairs. In the attic, she pulled out an old cabin trunk, unlocked it, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, a photograph of a young man in the uniform of a major in the Indian Army, and a small pearl-handled revolver. She weighed the revolver in her hand for a moment, then slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan and went downstairs again. At 4:30, Miss Marple arrived at Boulders, the pleasant stone house 1/2 mile beyond the church, where Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd kept goats, bees, and a permanent atmosphere of cordial disagreement. Miss Hinchcliffe greeted her with a shout that could have been heard in the next county. Come in. Bunny's in a state. Says Letty Blacklock's going to be murdered, and it's all her fault for losing prayer books." Miss Murgatroyd appeared, pink and flustered. "I didn't say it was my fault exactly. Only, oh, Miss Marple, what do you think we ought to do?" "My dear," said Miss Marple comfortably, "I think we ought to have a cup of tea and talk sensibly. Fear is a great fog. A little light disperses it wonderfully." Over strong tea and scones, Miss Murgatroyd poured out her troubles. "It's that scrap of paper. Letty was so angry when you left. Not with you, with herself, I think. She kept saying nobody must ever know, and then she locked the prayer book in the bureau and took the key. And then she telephoned someone, I couldn't hear who, and said, 'It's gone far enough. We must finish it tonight.' And she sounded almost relieved." Miss Hinchcliffe gave a snort. "Finish what? That's what I'd like to know. There's something queer about the whole setup at Little Paddocks. Always has been. That girl Mitzi, for one thing. She's terrified of Letty, yet she won't leave. And young Patrick Simmons turns up without warning and stays for days, borrowing money. And then there's Philippa Hames." "Philippa?" Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Hinchcliffe lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Between ourselves, I'm almost certain she's not Philippa Hames at all. I knew a girl exactly like her in the war. Same cheekbones, same way of holding her head. Name of Julia Simmons. Ran off with an American officer and was posted missing, believed killed. But there she is, large as life, weeding Letty's roses." Miss Murgatroyd gave a squeak of excitement. "Do you think she's Pip and Emma come back for the money?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that there are a great many people in St Mary Mead who are not quite what they pretend to be, and some of them are beginning to find the pretense uncomfortable." She rose. "I must not keep you from your bees, Miss Hinchcliffe. But if anything should happen this evening, anything at all, will you telephone me at once? I am only a foolish old woman, but sometimes foolishness sees what wisdom overlooks." At 6 o'clock, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. A watery sun appeared, low and red, turning the puddles to blood. At Little Paddocks, the grandfather clock in the hall prepared to strike the hour. Miss Blacklock stood in the drawing-room, the pearl-handled revolver heavy in her pocket. She had drawn the curtains against the dying light and lit only one lamp. The room looked larger in the half-darkness, full of shadows. The front door bell rang. She went herself, because Mitzi had departed in hysterics an hour earlier, and Philippa was nowhere to be found. On the doorstep stood a tall figure in a dark coat and a soft felt hat pulled low. A scarf concealed the lower part of the face. Miss Blacklock's hand closed on the revolver. "You are punctual," she said steadily. "Come in. We may as well have this out in comfort." The figure stepped into the hall. The grandfather clock began to chime 6. Miss Blacklock closed the door. In the drawing-room, the single lamp burned quietly. Outside, the last of the sunset bled away behind the trees, and in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the telephone, her knitting untouched in her lap, waiting for a call that she very much hoped would not come. The following morning, Wednesday, broke clear and cold. A light frost silvered the lawns of St Mary Mead, and the village, deprived of its expected murder at sunset, felt vaguely cheated, like theatre-goers who had been promised a hanging in Act 5 and received a wedding instead. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Craddock sat in Miss Marple's little drawing-room, his notebook open, his face a study in official bewilderment. Edmund Swettenham, née Patrick Simmons, née whatever he chose tomorrow, was in hospital under guard, his arm painful but in no danger. Julia Simmons, née Julia Girdler, was at the police station, alternately weeping and defiant. Charlotte Blacklock had spent the night at Little Paddocks under the eye of a police matron, silent and composed, refusing to answer questions until she had seen Miss Marple. "And that," said Craddock, "is why I'm here. She will speak to no one else. She says you will understand." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Poor woman. Yes, I will come." They drove to Little Paddocks in Artiantite, silence. The house looked smaller in daylight, almost shabby. Miss Murgatroyd met them at the door, round-eyed and trembling. "She's in the study," she whispered. "She sent me to bed last night and locked the door. I heard her walking up and down, until dawn." Charlotte Blacklock sat at the writing desk, a neat pile of papers before her. She had aged 10 years overnight. The competent cardinal was gone, and in her place sat a tired, plain woman with greying hair, and the stoop her sister Letitia had never lived long enough to acquire. She looked up as Miss Marple entered. "You were right," she said simply. "The truth is the only door left." She pushed the papers across the desk. "My confession, everything. The operation in Switzerland that cured me when everyone believed I would die. Letitia's cancer. The night we changed places. She begged me to do it, you know. She wanted the money to go to someone who would live to enjoy it. We were very alike even then. A little makeup, a different way of walking, and no one ever questioned. Belle Godler was already ill. Randall was dead. It seemed so simple. Miss Marple sat down opposite her, and then the children came back. First Julia, quiet, watchful. I recognized her at once. Randall's eyes. I hoped she would be content to wait for Belle to die naturally. Then Edmund arrived, all charm and threats. He had found letters in his mother's desk in France. He wanted everything at once. When I realized they were both here, watching me, I panicked. The note was meant to be burnt, but it fell from my prayer book at the vicarage. I tried to turn it into a mystery, to frighten them away. Instead, I frightened myself into a corner. She gave a small, wintry smile. You found the torn scrap. That was the end. Miss Marple spoke gently. There is still one thing I do not understand. Why the clock in the vicarage hall? Why mention it in the note? Charlotte looked surprised, as though the answer were obvious. Because that clock is always 6 minutes fast. Everyone in the village knows it. If I ever needed an alibi, if things went badly wrong, I could say I'd been at the vicarage arranging flowers at a certain time, and the clock would prove it. A silly precaution, but one clings to such things. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Yes, one does. Charlotte leaned forward. There is something else. Something you must do for me. She opened a drawer and took out a sealed envelope. This is addressed to Mrs. Belle Godler at her nursing home in Scotland. It contains a full account of the impersonation and a banker's draft for half the fortune, Julia's lawful share. Will you see that it reaches her, and will you ask her, when she is strong enough, to forgive me? Miss Marple took the envelope. I will. Charlotte sat back, suddenly exhausted. Thank you. And now, Inspector, I'm quite ready. Craddock stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand. One moment, if you please. She turned again to Charlotte. There is a small thing I've been wondering about. A test, if you like. You remember the evening of the fête when the note was found. You held the Bible in your left hand, yet you are right-handed. I noticed it at the time. It puzzled me. Later I realized you were protecting the book from the rain with your coat sleeve, your left sleeve, an awkward movement for a right-handed person. But you did it without thinking. Why? Charlotte looked at her for a long moment, and then, astonishingly, she smiled. A real smile, almost mischievous. Because, Miss Marple, for 30 years I've had to remember to be left-handed. My sister Letitia was left-handed. I am not. Sometimes, when I am tired or startled, the real hand takes over. You noticed, no one else ever did. Miss Marple inclined her head. Thank you. I wanted to be sure. Craddock cleared his throat. If that is all, Miss Blacklock. Charlotte rose. It is all. She walked out between the inspector and the matron with the same straight spine she had shown at the fête. But now there was no defiance in it, only a great weariness. Miss Murgatroyd watched from the window, tears running down her round cheeks. She was always Letty to me, she whispered. Always. Miss Marple patted her arm. My dear, she was Letty to herself for so long that she almost believed it. That is the saddest part. Outside, the frost was melting. A blackbird sang from the apple tree as though nothing had happened. But something had. A long deception had ended. Not with a gunshot in the dark, but with a quiet confession in daylight and a sealed envelope entrusted to an old lady who understood, better than most, how fragile truth can be and how strong. The inquest was held 10 days later in the village hall, a low, red brick building that normally smelled of floor polish and damp hymn books. On this occasion, it smelled of wet macintoshes and apprehension. Coroner, jury, witnesses, and half the population of St Mary Mead were present. The other half stood outside on the steps, hoping for crumbs. Inspector Craddock gave evidence with admirable brevity. Dr. Haydock described the bullet wound in Edmund Swettenham's upper arm, painful, but in no way dangerous. Julia Simmons, pale and composed in navy blue, admitted her identity and her attempt at blackmail. And then Charlotte Blacklock, wearing the same dark green dress she had worn on the evening of the sunset appointment, took the oath in a voice that did not tremble. She told the whole story again, quietly, clearly, without drama. The exchange of identities in the Swiss clinic, the years of careful deception, the gradual realization that Pip and Emma had survived after all and were closing in, the foolish note written in panic and never meant to see daylight, the final confrontation. When she had finished, there was complete silence in the hall. Even Mrs. Price Ridley forgot to sniff. The coroner removed his glasses and polished them. "Miss Blacklock, do you wish to add anything further?" "Only this," Charlotte said. "I deceived many people for many years, but I deceived no one more completely than myself. I thought I could carry my sister's name and live her life better than she could have done. I was wrong. A stolen life is no life at all. I am grateful that it is over." She sat down. The jury returned a verdict of justifiable wounding in the case of Edmund Swettenham and recommended that Charlotte Blacklock be charged with no offense more serious than obtaining money by false pretenses over a long period. The coroner, who had known the real Letitia Blacklock slightly in the old days, added that he would see the papers were placed before the proper authorities with a strong recommendation to mercy. And that, to all intents and purposes, was that, but not quite. Afterwards, in the little room behind the platform that smelled of mice and choir robes, Miss Marple sat alone with Charlotte Blacklock for the last time. "I wish to thank you," Charlotte said. "You could have exposed me at any moment after you found the torn scrap. You did not." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, "there is exposure and exposure. Some truths are better coaxed into the daylight than dragged." Charlotte gave a faint smile. "You knew almost from the beginning, didn't you?" "Not the details. But the shape, yes. One has seen so many deceptions in villages. A woman who is supposed to be left-handed but uses her right hand when off guard. A woman who flinches when an old clock is mentioned because she has used it as a private alibi. A woman who is terrified yet refuses to leave the house where the danger supposedly waits. Fear of an enemy outside is one thing. Fear of discovery from within is quite another." She paused, her eyes gentle. "And then there was the Bible itself. A strange choice for a threatening note unless the writer knew the recipient would be the one to open it at the vicarage, and knew also that the recipient had a deep, almost superstitious reverence for the book. The real Letitia Blacklock had been brought up strictly. Charlotte, the younger sister, had absorbed the same training. It was a small thing, but it fitted." Charlotte nodded slowly. "I see. I was never as clever as I thought." "None of us is," Miss Marple said comfortably. "That is what makes human beings so perpetually interesting." A wardress appeared at the door. Time was up. Charlotte rose. "Bunny, Murgatroyd, will she be all right?" "She will be looked after. Mrs. Bantry has already invited her to stay at Gossington for as long as she wishes, and Miss Hinchcliffe has offered her a cottage on very easy terms when she feels ready. She loved you, you know. Not the name, but you." Charlotte's eyes filled. Tell her I was happy while it lasted." She was gone. Miss Marple walked home through the village. The news had spread. People stood in little knots discussing the affair with the shocked pleasure of those who discover that the quietest neighbor may harbor the most astonishing secrets. Mrs. Price Ridley waylaid her at the post office. Well, who would have thought it? All those years, and that poor deceived creature thinking she was safe in St Mary Mead of all places. Miss Marple regarded her mildly. "My dear, St Mary Mead is exactly the place where such a deception might succeed. In London, no one notices anyone. In a village, everyone notices everyone, but they notice what they expect to notice. Charlotte Blacklock gave them a competent, rather reserved spinster with money and a slight limp. That is what they saw. One can hide in full view if one is careful enough. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed, unconvinced. Miss Marple continued homeward. At her gate she paused and looked back at the village, the church tower, the roofs, the curling smoke from cottage chimneys. All exactly as it had been a fortnight ago, and yet everything subtly altered, like a familiar room after a picture has been rehung. She went indoors, took off her hat and coat, and sat down in her favorite chair by the fire. Cherry brought her a cup of tea in the afternoon post. On top lay a letter in a shaking old lady hand, the Scottish postmark. Miss Marple opened it. "My dear Miss Marple, the money arrived safely. I have instructed my solicitors to divide the estate as Charlotte wished. Half to Julia, half to various charities Letitia always supported. I'm not long for this world, but I die easier knowing the truth is out and no blood was shed for greed. Charlotte saved my husband's fortune for me once, long ago, by her cleverness. I think, in the end, she has saved my soul by her confession. Thank you for your kindness to a frightened woman. Yours very sincerely, Isabel Godler." Miss Marple folded the letter, laid it aside, and picked up her knitting. Outside, the short November day faded into early dusk. Somewhere a clock struck 4. She counted her stitches carefully, her lips moving in a soundless murmur. "Poor Charlotte," she said at last to the quiet room. Poor, clever, foolish Charlotte. She learned too late what so many never learn at all, that one cannot build happiness upon another person's grave, even when one has dug the grave with love. The fire settled in the grate with a little sigh, and the knitting needles clicked on, steady and unhurried, measuring out the small, necessary stitches that hold the world together when everything else has come unraveled. December came early to St Mary Mead that year. The first real frost held for a week, blackening the dahlias and turning the vicarage pond into clouded glass. The Women's Institute cancelled its usual pre-Christmas bazaar out of respect for recents. Events then, discovering that respect did not pay the coal merchant, quietly revived it under the new name of Winter Comforts Sale. Life, as Miss Marple had long ago observed, is remarkably resilient. Little Paddocks stood empty, its windows blind. A discreet "For Sale" board appeared at the gate, and the estate agent from Much Benham was seen measuring the drawing room with the air of a man who already had a buyer in mind. Miss Murgatroyd, Bunny to those who had known her longest, spent a fortnight with the Bantrys, then moved into the small rose-covered cottage that Miss Hinchcliffe had once used for storing apples. She kept bees now, and was often seen walking to the post office in an enormous veil that made her look like a mournful ghost. Julia Simmons, or Julia Godler, as the newspapers insisted, had vanished to Scotland to nurse the dying Belle Godler and, it was whispered, to meet the half-American child she had left behind years before. No one in the village quite liked to ask whether she would return. Charlotte Blacklock had been sentenced, after much legal murmuring, to 18 months' imprisonment, a term so light that Mrs. Price Ridley declared the judges must have gone soft in the head. She served it in an open prison in Buckinghamshire, where, according to the chaplain's wife who wrote to Miss Marple, she organized the library with terrifying efficiency and was much in demand as a listener. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, Miss Marple sat by her fire, addressing cards in her fine, spidery hand. The room smelled of evergreen and warm spice. Cherry was baking mince pies in the kitchen and singing, rather tunelessly, "In the Bleak Midwinter." The postman brought a single letter. The envelope was cheap prison issue, the handwriting firm and upright. "My dear Miss Marple, they tell me I shall be released in the spring. Good behavior, whatever that may mean in such a place. Bunny has written that the cottage next to hers will be vacant then, if she is willing, and if the village can bear another black sheep. I should like to come back. Not to Little Paddocks, that belongs to the past, but to a small place where I may keep a few books and perhaps a cat. I've learned, rather late in life, that one does not need a large house or a large fortune or even a name that truly belongs to one in order to be of use. If St Mary Mead will have me, I shall endeavour to earn my welcome. Yours with gratitude, C. Blacklock. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then laid it on the mantelpiece beside Belle Godler's earlier note, now framed in plain wood, and a sprig of holly. She picked up her pen again and added one more card to the pile. Miss Charlotte, Blacklock H.M. Prison, Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire. My dear Charlotte, the cottage is already promised to you. Bunny has planted lavender along the path in anticipation, and the vicar's wife has set aside a stack of detective novels she thinks you will enjoy cataloguing. St Mary Mead has a long memory, but it is not an unforgiving one. We have all, at some time or another, borrowed a name or a reputation or a happiness that was not quite our own. You will find, I think, that people are kinder than you expect once the worst is known and over. Come home when you can. There will be a kettle on the hob and a chair by the fire. Yours ever, Jane Marple. She sealed the card, affixed a stamp, and placed it on the hall table for the afternoon collection. Outside, the church bells began to ring for evensong, clear, frosty, and utterly familiar. Children ran past the gate shouting seasonable greetings, and somewhere a dog barked with hysterical joy at the prospect of snow. Miss Marple returned to her fireside and took up her knitting once more. A small Shetland shawl this time, the color of winter violets. Human nature, she murmured to the quietly ticking clock, is a very crooked garment, but now and then, if one is patient, it can be persuaded to hang straight after all. The needles clicked steadily. In the kitchen, Cherry launched into the second verse of her carol, still flat but indomitably cheerful. And in the little cottage that waited beyond the churchyard, the lavender slept under frost, dreaming of a spring that would bring, against all probability, forgiveness.